Okay, so as you can see, I've made some progress here, finally on my Kyosho Lazer ZXS Evolution restoration. Um, so for this particular restoration, I decided not to do like a live series, so to speak, or a real-time series, because each one of those videos I did in my previous build for the Schumacher Cat 3000, I noticed that it didn't get a whole lot of views per video, which, I'm not a monetized channel, so I don't really care about that. But B, more importantly, is, to keep you guys engaged and interested, I want to have a sort of a shorter video that gets to the key points. If I just have this sort of 45-minute long or hour-long video, I have to keep talking in the video in order to keep you engaged. And a lot of times when I do builds just on my own, I'm quiet. I'm silent. I'm just thinking about the build. So I don't want it to be like this sort of artificial process. But in any case, hopefully this one will just be my usual maybe 10-minute or so update on the build status. So again, I have two ZXS chassis. There's the ZXS, which is up there, and the ZXS Evo, which is this. This one isn't. They're both in, let's say, used, not great condition, but the Evo was in far worse condition. So I'm starting with this. Now, I do have the original carbon fiber parts out for reproduction, and some of those parts, like the towers and a few other pieces, I'm also modifying the design a little bit. So while I'm waiting on those, because I do have another project in mind for those anyway, I have a whole set of parts from Fiberlight, which are fantastic quality as usual. So what did I do? I started with the chassis. I did front gearbox and a little bit of the rear. I am doing a fair amount of this out of order, just out of sort of personal preference for how to do the build. So the way the build starts is you start with the front kick-up plate, and then you put the front gearbox, or the top half of the front gearbox together, and then you do, basically the whole front gearbox, and then you move on to the front part of the front suspension. So anything related to putting on like turnbuckles and ball cups and caster blocks and steering knuckles, I'm going to wait till later for that. First thing I want to do is get the gearbox, the drivetrains done, and then I'll move on to the suspension components. That's just the way I prefer to do it. Also, I do want to get replacement turnbuckles because, this comes with the original steel units, which, I'd rather get titanium turnbuckles. And I also noticed that the turnbuckles that go on the front here, these are like 15 millimeter, 16 millimeter units. They are different between the left and right. I think one of these is titanium, possibly this one. This one looks like a steel unit, clearly a different adjusting nut. So I just want to get sort of the same of everything. So I got to put these aside and get new units. That's another reason why I'm waiting to do the suspension bits. So in any case, what have I noticed so far? Well, the front gearbox is certainly more difficult to put together than on a normal Lazer ZX or ZXR, because on the Lazer ZX, it's a two-piece gearbox. You have a front section and a back section, and the diff pulley sort of mounts in from the front with the the diff pulley. My vocabulary is off today. And the diff belt just comes in and wraps around it as you mount it in, and then you put the front cover on and you sort of bolt it on. This one has 4 quadrants for the gearbox. You have a lower left and a lower right, and then over here an upper left and an upper right. Putting the top section together is the most challenging because the way that the left and right attach is through the front shock tower. So what you're basically doing is balancing like 3 or 4 parts against each other. So for instance, you might take these right 2 screws, put them through the tower, put them into sort of the top, well, looking out this way, the top left quadrant of the front gearbox, and then you have this Lexan piece that goes in the middle between these two. That's this guy right here. So that's sort of like your dirt protection cover. You have to hold that in place. There's nothing, I guess you could glue it, but there's nothing to actually secure that in place while you're mounting the other half of the top of the gearbox to the front shock tower. So you have to sort of hold this in. There's a little notch in here where it kind of slots in. So you got to put that in and sort of notch this one into here and sort of hold this in while you're screwing this in. It's a little difficult to do with just two hands, but clearly it's manageable. It's just kind of a pain. So, okay, you do that, and then you mount the lower section, and this is also, as you're screwing in one side here, this other side is going to try to move around, so trying to hold all that in place without it sort of misaligning as you're tightening it down is also not fun. This it's the front rear inner hinge pin mount. This does look a little bit fragile. It is a different unit than what you have on the ZX and the ZXR. I think because on the ZX and the ZXR, the chassis was flat. And on the ZXS and the ZXS Evo, you have that front kick up to the chassis. So they had to redesign this inner hinge pin mount to accommodate that kick up in the chassis, which means the inside of this is actually a little bit thinner than what you have on the ZX or ZXR inner hinge pin mount. So, okay, fine. That's another reason why I got all these, 3D printed reproduction parts. I expect to order a couple sets of these just for my own internal consumption, because I don't know exactly, what I can expect to break on the racetrack if I do race this. Anyway, moving on. So then, you put the diff in, you mount this, you screw this thing on. These back two screws here, you don't fully tighten them down because there's a gap between the top section, which is this sort of upper, if I go back here, this piece here, whatever you call it, there's a gap between that, which is right here, I believe, and the top section of the gearbox. The upper deck is going to slot into there, and these back two screws are going to mount through that. So you don't tighten these all the way, you just screw them in a little bit just to hold it in place, and then later on you take these out, you put that upper deck and you screw it back down. Okay, fine. So that goes together. What I am doing is replacing these diffs. I'm actually I have over here a Lazer ZX that I built some years ago, probably, maybe 9 years ago or so by now. This was my first Lazer project car, and I did get like brand new diffs for it when I built it, brand new, slipper clutch, everything. And it was just sitting around, and I needed, basically, I wanted, how do I put this, the correct diffs, so to speak, or the original style diffs for this gearbox, or for this Lazer rather, because these diffs here, well, one of them is actually a front one-way unit, okay, and then the other one is, a ball diff, but the actual pulleys, as you can see, are white. And all the Lazer models, the ZXR, the ZXS, they came with black diff pulleys. So these particular pulleys, I believe, might be from Team Atlas. They could be aftermarket pulleys. Okay, fine, that's no big deal. But I like to have matching front and rear pulleys, and I don't want to use a front one-way. I hate one-ways. So if I'm just going to have one white pulley and one black pulley, I'd rather have two black pulleys front and rear, which means I gotta sort of take that car apart and move those diffs to here. Those are brand new diffs. They've just been sitting in that car for years, but brand new. So I'm gonna put them in here and actually give them some use. As to what I'll be putting in there, maybe I'll actually clean these up and put them in that Lazer, because that Lazer is more of a shelf car anyway. So that's probably what I'll do with these. Okay, moving on. So the front gearbox is kind of set. And by the way, while I'm at it, I want to comment a bit on even though the front gearbox is kind of a pain, there is something about it that I do like compared to the ZXR style gearbox. And it has to do with the types of belts you can use. So on the Lazer, if I go back here, on the normal Lazer, you need to use belts with a thin spine. You can see here, this belt has a very thin spine, and you can get these from Tough Racing. I have tried and tried and tried to find a domestic source for these so that I don't have to order from overseas, but I can't find them. And what happens is, the reason why you need to do this is because the inside molding of the front gearbox has very tight clearance against the diff pulley. So if you use a more conventional timing belt, like one of these guys, which has a thicker spine, it's going to rub against the inside of the gearbox. But because the way this is set up, there's a bit more room on the front for this to sort of move around. The only issue, if anything, would be the clearance between the diff pulley and sort of the top surface here of the kick-up plate. But I can't really do it with one hand, but as this tensions up, you do get a little bit of a gap between the kick-up plate and the belt, so that it should spin freely, which is nice because that gives you a lot more options for places you can order belts from for this particular gearbox, for a ZXS style gearbox. The rear is very similar, right? You have in the rear gearbox, it's kind of an open style with like a Lexan cover on the back. So I expect to be able to use, belts like that. And by the way, the front belt is a 3mm 576, or 3mm wide, 576 in circumference. I don't know how many teeth that is, I forget, but I did count out, how many teeth were on, excuse me, the original belt, which is a bit worn. And so then I just ordered, a bunch of some replacement belts that have a thicker spine. So I'm glad that these appear to work. Time will tell as I go through the build how that actually works with the rear gearbox, because I already put about half of it together. There is a roller bearing here that holds the belt down onto the center pulleys, and if the spine is thicker on this belt, it might actually not play nicely with this particular roller bearing, because the amount of clearance between the belt pulley and the outer surface of this bearing, I'd have to imagine was really set up for the original belt, which had a thinner spine. So you add maybe half a millimeter or a millimeter or so to the spine, that's going to put a lot of it could cause binding here, even though there's a bearing. So we'll see how that goes. If it doesn't work out, then I'll just have to figure out maybe a smaller bearing to put here, or maybe I can, since this is not an original carbon fiber part, maybe I can take the hole that this mounts into and slot it, so I can move this up a little bit, make it somewhat adjustable. So we'll see how that goes. Let's see, what else did I have in mind that I want to discuss here? So just putting this rear gearbox together is, as you can probably tell, not exactly straightforward. It's, again, it's not like the Lazer ZX and ZXR rear gearbox like this guy here, which I apologize if the lighting is poor, but this is basically a three-piece gearbox. You have a main body, and then there's a little section on this side that you put the diff in, and then there's another plastic section right here that's part of the lay shaft assembly, as you assemble the lay shaft as you assemble the gearbox. This is sealed, great for keeping dirt out, and it's relatively simple to put together, with the exception of how the lay shaft goes together. That's always a bit of a pain on these Lazers. But this one, not only are you dealing with the lay shaft assembly, it's also a bunch of spacers, and you have to kind of put multiple spacers in at the same time and screw them in at the same time while holding everything together. So, I guess it's entertaining. So that's really where I am now. I guess one final thing I want to point out is I think I figured out a way to lock or almost lock this center front pulley. So the way this mounts onto this particular lay shaft, there's a one-way pulley, and there's no slot on this particular section of the lay shaft to allow you to lock that pulley down. Although it's kind of strange because the ZXRR also has the same type of slipper clutch unit. It's, I forget what it's called. What's it called? The hyper clutch, sorry. And that has a different pulley arrangement, just like the particular types of pulleys that are used on the ZXRR than what you see here on the ZXS, even though the slipper clutch itself, the hyper clutch unit, is exactly the same. So this lay shaft is probably custom to the ZXS, which is a little odd, I suppose. So that means I need kind of a custom solution here. So essentially all I did was, you have there's a 4mm, like a 4x6 shim that goes on this side that connects to, let me just get to a picture. Yeah, so here is the outer portion of the lay shaft assembly. All this is all this stuff here on the lay shaft. So basically this is your one-way pulley with a bearing, and then this little cap, a washer, and this big fat bearing, and then this little guy here is like a 4mm inner diameter shim. Essentially it's a shim. And normally there'd be this little plastic thing. Where did I put that? I put that over here, didn't I? Where the hell did that go? Am I already losing parts? Oh, here it is. This little plastic piece right here that would go on to the end and just sort of hold everything in place, and then a plastic nut you put on the threaded end here and just sort of, it holds it in place. But that means you get full one-way action on this pulley. So what you can do instead is, this is the slipper clutch spring that from one of several Outlaw Rampage Pros or Kyosho Pro X's that I have lying around, because I got a few of those gearboxes. So I just took that spring. It was about the right size. I put it on, and then I put some washers on at the end to basically reduce the slack I have, because that particular spring is a little bit on the small side. So I needed to add some effective thickness here so that when I screw this lock nut down, by the time I hit the end of the threading on the lay shaft, I need enough tension in that spring to push that shim against this bearing, against this one-way, to sort of bind it up. Okay, so you can use you use a longer spring and fewer spacers here, but ultimately you need a spring here. Very similar to what I had done on one of my Yokomo YZ10s, although in that case I didn't have a threaded section of lay shaft on this side. I had to use a different trick. But basically use a spring so you can hold some tension against that one-way. And this seems to work very well. It's not completely locked, but you do need a fair amount of force to force this one-way to move. So that should be, I think, good enough for what I would like to use it for. Alright, so I'm already about 18 minutes on this video. That's really where I am right now. So I'm going to try to finish up the rear gearbox and then move on to other parts of the build. And yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.